When the mahogany doors of Whitmore Associates swung shut behind me that gray Seattle morning, I carried with me the weight of a secret that would shatter my family forever. The rain drummed against the law firm's floor-to-ceiling windows as James Liu, my father's attorney for 30 years, handed me an envelope marked "Confidential" to be opened only by Maya Chen. Inside was a key to a safety deposit box and a handwritten note in my father's familiar scrawl. "The empire was always meant for you. They never saw what I saw. My name is Maya Chen, and for 29 years, I was the family mistake. The unplanned daughter who disrupted the perfect picture, the one they whispered about behind closed doors, wondering how someone so ordinary could belong to the Chen dynasty. But as I stood there holding that note, I realized that my father, Richard Chen, had been playing a different game entirely, one where the underestimated piece becomes the queen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in my cramped Capitol Hill apartment, coffee brewing in my secondhand machine, rain streaking down windows that hadn't been cleaned by the landlord in months, and my phone buzzing with another message from my stepmother Patricia about the family dinner I was required to attend. Required, not invited. There's a difference when you're the afterthought daughter in a family that measures worth in quarterly earnings and social connections. I had been working for Chen Industries for 7 years, ever since graduating from University of Washington with a business degree that nobody in my family bothered to celebrate. While Derek, my half-brother, got a corner office and the title of executive vice president straight out of Stanford, I was given a cubicle in the residential development division and told to learn the business from the ground up. Ground level turned out to be permanent for someone with my last name, but wrong parentage. That particular morning, I was reviewing contracts for a small apartment complex renovation in Fremont when Sarah Martinez, my best friend since college and the only person at Chen Industries who treated me like I had a functioning brain, knocked on my cubicle wall. Her face was pale, almost gray, and her usually perfect makeup looked hastily applied. "Maya," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure we weren't overheard, "I need to talk to you, not here. Can you meet me at Victrola after work?" I had known Sarah for 8 years, and I'd never seen her look scared, not when she was auditing Derek's department and found discrepancies that would have gotten anyone else fired, not when she had to present budget projections to the entire board while Derek interrupted her every 30 seconds. But that morning, something in her eyes made my stomach twist. "What's wrong?" I whispered back. She shook her head quickly. "Not here. Just meet me at 5, okay? And Maya," she paused, her voice dropping even lower, "don't mention this to anyone, especially not your family." The rest of the day crawled by with the particular slowness reserved for moments when you know something significant is about to shift. I tried to focus on lease agreements and contractor bids, but my mind kept circling back to Sarah's expression. The fear in her voice, the way she'd emphasized, especially not your family, like they were the very people I should be most afraid of. At exactly 5 o'clock, I found Sarah at our usual table in the back corner of Victrola Coffee, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had clearly gone cold. She'd chosen the spot deliberately, far from any other 10 Industries employees who might frequent the Capitol Hill coffee shop, with a clear view of everyone coming and going. "I've been going through the books," she said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "All of them. The main company financials, the subsidiary reports, even the personal accounts I have access to as senior accountant." I waited, sensing that whatever she was about to tell me required patience. "Maya, your father has been moving money. Lots of money. And not just recently. This has been going on for years. Maybe since you started working for the company." She pulled out her phone and showed me a document that meant nothing to my untrained eye, but clearly meant everything to hers. He's been setting up trusts, moving assets, restructuring ownership in ways that nobody else knows about. Not Patricia, not Derek, not even Robert. Robert Steinberg was Patricia's brother and the chief financial officer of Chen Industries. He had been the one to hire Derek straight into his executive position and the one who'd suggested I start in a more appropriate role for someone with my experience level. In other words, he had been the architect of keeping me small. I don't understand, I said, though part of me was beginning to. What kind of money are we talking about? Sarah's laugh was bitter, the kind that would make Derek's yearly bonus look like lunch money. Maya, I think your father has been preparing for something big, and I think it has to do with you. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my bed, staring at the ceiling of my tiny apartment, and thinking about every interaction I'd had with my father over the past few years. How he'd started asking me more questions about my projects. How he'd begun including me in meetings that Derek assumed were about my training, but that focused heavily on long-term strategic planning. How he'd insisted I learn every aspect of the business, even the parts that seemed irrelevant to my residential development role. At the time, I assumed my father was just being polite, giving the family disappointment a chance to participate before the real decisions were made by the real heir. But what if I'd been wrong? What if those moments weren't charity, but evaluation? The next morning brought the call that changed everything. I was just finishing my shower when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was professional, careful, and completely devastating. Miss Chen, this is Dr. Elizabeth Warren from Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. I'm calling about your father, Richard Chen. He's asked me to contact you personally. The world tilted. My father had been looking tired lately, maybe a little thinner, but he was 68 and worked 16-hour days. I'd assumed it was normal aging, the natural consequence of building an empire from nothing. Miss Chen?
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Are you there? Yes, I managed. I'm here. Your father has asked me to inform you that he's been receiving treatment here for the past 14 months. Stage 3 pancreatic cancer. He's asked that we arrange a private meeting between the two of you this afternoon if you're available. I sat down hard on my bed, water from my hair dripping onto my shoulders. 14 months. He'd been fighting cancer for 14 months and I'd had no idea. Which meant Patricia hadn't known either, or Derek, or anyone else in the family. He'd been carrying this alone. Miss Chen, he's specifically requested that you not inform any other family members about this conversation. He'll be the one to share the information when he feels it's appropriate. 3 hours later, I sat in a private room at the cancer center, watching my father, the man who'd built a billion-dollar empire through sheer force of will, look smaller than I'd ever seen him. The chair seemed to swallow him, and his usually commanding presence had been replaced by something quieter, more deliberate. Maya, he said, and his voice still carried that familiar authority despite everything. I suppose you're wondering why I kept this from everyone. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Because, he continued, I needed time to put things in order. And I needed to make decisions about the future without interference from people who think they already know how this story ends. He leaned forward, and for the first time in my life, I had his complete, undivided attention. Not the polite interest he showed at family dinners, not the casual questions about my work. This was different. This was a father looking at his daughter and seeing something no one else had bothered to look for. They think you're weak, he said simply. Patricia, Derek, Robert, even Marcus. They think you're the mistake who got lucky enough to have the Chen name but never earned the right to carry it forward. They think you're too soft, too ordinary, too small for what this company requires. Each word hit like a physical blow. Not because they were cruel, but because they were true. Because I'd believed the same things about myself for so long that hearing them spoken aloud felt like confirmation rather than accusation. But they're wrong, he said, and his voice grew stronger. They see kindness and assume weakness.
They see thoughtfulness and assume indecision. They see someone who listens before speaking and assume someone who has nothing worth saying. I finally found my voice. Dad, what are you telling me? He smiled then, and it was the first genuine smile I'd seen from him in years. Not the careful expression he wore at board meetings or the practiced warmth he showed at charity events. This was real. I'm telling you that I've been watching. For years, Maya. I've been watching how you handle problems, how you treat people, how you think about solutions. I've been watching how you work twice as hard as Derek for half the recognition, and how you do it without becoming bitter or cruel. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope, thick and official looking. I'm telling you that when I started this company 35 years ago, I didn't build it so that someone like Derek could inherit it. I built it so that someone like you could transform it into something even better. The envelope felt heavy in my hands, heavier than paper should feel. Don't open it yet, and don't tell anyone about this conversation. Not Sarah, not anyone. In a few weeks, there's going to be a family meeting, a reading of my will and testament. Let them think whatever they want to think until then. I stared at the envelope, my name written across it in his careful handwriting. Dad, are you... I'm dying, Maya. Probably within the next 2 months, according to Dr. Warren. But I'm not gone yet, and I still have work to do. Work that includes making sure the right person takes over when I'm no longer here to protect what we've built. He stood up slowly, and for a moment he looked like the Richard Chen who'd intimidated competitors and charmed investors for 3 decades. Until then, keep being exactly who you are. Keep doing your job. Keep being underestimated. Keep letting them think they know how this story ends. Because the best victories, Maya, are the ones nobody sees coming. That night, I sat in my apartment holding the unopened envelope and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. A sense that maybe, just maybe, I hadn't been reading the situation correctly. That maybe the story I'd been telling myself about being the unwanted mistake was missing some crucial chapters. But even as that possibility settled in my chest like a warm stone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead. Because if my father was right, if I really was meant for something bigger than Derek and Patricia and Robert believed I deserved, then the moment that truth came to light would be the moment everything exploded. And explosions, I was beginning to understand, have a way of destroying everything in their path before the dust settles and you can see what's actually left standing. The family dinner that Friday arrived with the warmth of a business merger. Patricia had set the table in the formal dining room of the Mercer Island estate, the one with the crystal chandelier that cost more than my annual salary and windows overlooking Lake Washington. Everything was positioned with mathematical precision, from the imported orchid centerpiece to the way our napkins were folded into perfect triangles. Derek sat to my father's right, as always, while I occupied my usual spot between Marcus and the empty chair that had belonged to my mother before she died when I was 12. Victoria, Derek's wife, glided into the room wearing a dress that probably cost more than my rent, her blonde hair swept into an updo that required professional assistance. She kissed the air near my cheek, a gesture that managed to be both affectionate and dismissive simultaneously. Marcus arrived last, as usual, checking his phone even as he took his seat. He worked in venture capital now, having left the family business 3 years ago to pursue his own path, which really meant that he got tired of being Derek's subordinate but lacked the spine to challenge the hierarchy directly. My father looked better than he had at the cancer center, though I now noticed things I'd missed before. The way his suit jacket hung a little loose around his shoulders, how he moved more deliberately, as if to conserve energy for what mattered most. When he spoke, his voice still commanded the room, but there was an underlying carefulness that hadn't been there 6 months ago. I wanted to gather everyone tonight, he began, cutting into his salmon with surgical precision, because there are some changes coming at Chen Industries. Expansions, new opportunities, and some decisions that will affect our family's involvement in the company moving forward.
Affect all of us.
Derek straightened immediately, the way he always did when business was mentioned. This was his territory, his moment to shine. "The Portland acquisition?" he asked, referring to a hotel chain we'd been negotiating to purchase for 8 months. "Among other things," my father replied, but his eyes moved around the table in a way that felt deliberate. "Maya, how is the Fremont project progressing?" The question caught me off guard. My residential projects were never discussed at family dinners. They were too small, too insignificant for the dining room where billion-dollar decisions were usually dissected. "It's going well," I said carefully. "We're ahead of schedule and under budget. The contractor I found has been exceptional, and we're looking at a profit margin about 15% higher than projected." Patricia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "That's nice, dear," she said in the tone she used when discussing weather or traffic. Polite but utterly uninterested. But my father nodded slowly, as if I'd said something profound. 15%? That's significant money when you scale it up across multiple properties. "Well, it's just residential," Derek interjected smoothly. "Small potatoes compared to the commercial developments. Speaking of which, I've been working on the waterfront project downtown. We're looking at potential profits in the hundreds of millions." Derek launched into a detailed explanation of his latest deal, and I watched the familiar dance play out. He spoke with confidence and authority about market projections and zoning permits and investor meetings. Patricia hung on every word, asking thoughtful questions and making appreciative sounds. Marcus nodded along, occasionally offering insights that Derek accepted graciously. Victoria smiled proudly at her husband's expertise. And my father listened with the expression he wore during board meetings. Attentive but neutral, taking in information without revealing his thoughts. When Derek finished his presentation, Patricia turned to me with the smile she reserved for children and pets. "Maya, dear, have you been dating anyone? It would be so nice if you found someone to settle down with. You're not getting any younger, you know." The comment landed like it always did, with surgical precision. At 29, I was apparently racing against some invisible clock that measured female worth in marriage certificates and baby announcements. Never mind that Derek hadn't married Victoria until he was 32, or that Marcus was 34 and showed no signs of settling down with anyone. "I'm focused on my career right now," I said, the response I'd perfected over years of similar conversations. Victoria laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. "Oh, Maya, you're so serious about everything. It's just residential development. It's not like you're running the company or anything." The words were delivered with Victoria's trademark sweetness, the kind that made it impossible to object without seeming petty. But they hit their target with perfect accuracy. Just residential development. Not like you're running the company. The casual dismissal of everything I had worked for, wrapped in concern for my romantic life. I felt my father's eyes on me, watching my reaction with that same careful attention he'd shown at the cancer center, waiting to see how I'd respond. "You're right," I said evenly. "I'm not running the company, but I'm learning every aspect of it, which has been valuable." Derek smiled indulgently. "That's the spirit. Everyone needs to start somewhere, right? Dad always says you have to work your way up." The conversation moved on to safer topics. Marcus's latest investment, Victoria's charity luncheon, Patricia's plans for redecorating the guest wing. I finished my salmon and listened to the familiar rhythm of a family that had learned to function around a specific hierarchy. Derek at the top, Marcus as the acceptable alternative, and me as the well-meaning relative who meant well, but would never quite belong at the adults' table. After dinner, as Patricia served coffee and dessert in the living room, my father asked me to join him in his study. The request wasn't unusual. He often used family gatherings to discuss minor work matters or ask about my projects. But tonight, with the envelope still hidden in my apartment and the weight of our conversation at the cancer center between us, everything felt charged with significance.
His study was exactly what you'd expect from a man who'd built an empire. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions and business biographies, a desk the size of a small car, mahogany, like everything else in the house, photos from groundbreaking ceremonies and ribbon cuttings, handshakes with mayors and governors and celebrities whose hotels we'd built or renovated. But tonight, he didn't sit behind the desk. Instead, he chose one of the leather chairs by the fireplace and gestured for me to take the other. The fire crackled softly between us, casting warm light across his face and making him look more like a father than a CEO. "How are you feeling?" he asked simply. I knew he wasn't asking about the salmon or the conversation at dinner. He was asking about us, about the secret we now shared, about the weight of knowing something that would change everything. "Confused," I said honestly. "Scared. I keep thinking about what you said, about the envelope, about everything, and I keep wondering if I'm strong enough for whatever you're planning." He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with the expression he wore when making difficult decisions. "When I started this company, I was 26 years old with a business degree and more ambition than sense. I bought my first property with money I borrowed against everything I owned, including the engagement ring I'd bought for your mother. I'd heard the story before, but never told this way. Usually, it was polished smooth by repetition at company events and investor meetings. Tonight, it felt raw and personal. Everyone told me I was crazy. The bank, my father, even my mother, though she supported me anyway. They said the market was too competitive, that I was too young, that I didn't have the connections or the capital to succeed. They weren't wrong about any of those things. I was young, I was undercapitalized, and I definitely didn't have connections. But they were wrong about one crucial thing. They assumed those disadvantages would stop me. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and I waited for him to continue. "You remind me of myself at that age, Maya. Not Derek, not Marcus. You. You have the same hunger, the same willingness to work twice as hard as everyone else, the same ability to see opportunities that other people miss because they're looking in the wrong direction. But I'm not like you," I said quietly. "I don't command rooms the way you do. I
Don't make people listen when I talk." He smiled, and it was sad and proud at the same time. "Your mother used to say the same thing about herself. She thought she was too quiet, too gentle for the business world. But she was wrong, and so are you. There's more than one way to lead, Maya. Derek leads by talking louder than everyone else. You lead by being right more often than anyone expects." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire and the distant sound of conversation from the living room. I could hear Derek's voice, animated and confident, probably telling another story about his latest success. "I need you to do something for me," my father said eventually. "I need you to attend the board meeting next Thursday. I'm going to announce some changes to the company structure, and I want you there." Board meetings were Derek's domain. I had never been invited to one, never even been inside the conference room where they were held. Why? Because it's time for people to start seeing you differently. And sometimes, Maya, the only way to change how people see you is to put yourself somewhere they can't ignore you. Monday morning brought a call that shifted the entire landscape. I was reviewing contractor estimates when Sarah appeared at my cubicle, her face pale and her usual composure completely shattered. "Maya," she whispered urgently, "I need you to come with me. Right now." She led me to a supply closet on the third floor, far from our usual work areas and away from any possibility of being overheard. When she closed the door behind us, I could barely make out her expression in the dim light filtering through the small window. "Robert's been asking questions about the accounts I've been accessing," she said without preamble. "Specific questions about why I've been looking at trust documents and subsidiary reports that aren't part of my normal responsibilities." My stomach dropped. "What did you tell him?" "That I was doing a comprehensive audit for year-end reporting. He seemed to accept it, but
Maya, he's watching me now, and if he's watching me, he might start paying attention to what I've been finding. She pulled out her phone and showed me a document that made my head spin. Numbers and account names and legal terminology that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Your father hasn't just been moving money, she said quietly. He's been restructuring the entire ownership of Chen Industries. Piece by piece, over the past 5 years, he's been transferring assets into trusts and subsidiary companies that don't show up on the main corporate reports. I stared at the screen, trying to understand what I was looking at. What does that mean? It means that on paper, Derek and Marcus and even Robert think they know who owns what percentage of the company, but the reality is completely different. Maya, based on what I can see, your father has been preparing to transfer controlling interest to someone that nobody expects. The supply closet suddenly felt smaller, stuffier. You think it's me? I think it's definitely you. But Maya, if Robert figures out what I've been looking at, if he starts digging into the same documents, she trailed off, but I understood. If Robert discovered what my father had been doing before the official announcement, there would be time to challenge it, to fight it, to potentially stop it. What should I do? Sarah's expression was grim. Act normal. Don't change anything about how you behave at work or at home. And Maya, whatever happens in the next few weeks, don't trust anyone except the people you absolutely have to trust. That afternoon, Derek stopped by my cubicle for the first time in months. He perched on the edge of my desk with the casual confidence of someone who owned everything around him, including the people. "Hey, little sister," he said with his trademark smile. "How's life in the residential trenches?" The question was casual, but something in his tone felt different, more calculating than usual, like he was fishing for information rather than making conversation. "Same as always," I replied carefully. "Lots of small projects, lots of details to manage." Right, right. I was talking to Dad the other day, and he mentioned you've been asking good questions in meetings lately, getting more involved in strategic planning. I kept my expression neutral, even though my pulse quickened. Had my father mentioned our conversation? Had Derek noticed something different about how I was being included in discussions? I'm just trying to understand the business better. Dad's always encouraged us to learn all aspects of the company. Derek nodded thoughtfully. Absolutely. Education is important. Although, there's a difference between understanding the business and actually running it. Some people are natural leaders and others are more suited to supporting roles. The comment was delivered with Derek's usual charm, but the message was clear. Know your place, stay in your lane, don't get ideas above your station. Of course, I said, I'm definitely still learning. Good, good. Oh, and Maya, I heard you're planning to attend the board meeting Thursday. That's great. It'll be educational for you to see how major decisions get made. He said it casually, but I caught the slight emphasis on educational, as if my presence would be tolerated as a learning experience, but not taken seriously as actual participation. After he left, I sat staring at my computer screen and feeling the weight of everything closing in around me. The envelope in my apartment, Sarah's discoveries, my father's illness, Derek's casual condescension masking what might be genuine concern about changes he sensed but couldn't quite identify. Thursday was approaching fast, and I was beginning to understand that the board meeting wouldn't just be an announcement. It would be the beginning of a war that nobody except my father and I knew was coming. That evening, I drove to Mercer Island Estate for what would be my last family dinner as the unwanted mistake. Patricia had prepared my father's favorite meal, beef Wellington with roasted vegetables and a chocolate souffle that required precise timing and professional skill. The dining room looked exactly as it always did, formal and expensive and designed to remind everyone of their place in the hierarchy. But tonight, as I watched Derek dominate the conversation and Patricia hang on his every word, as I listened to Marcus make diplomatic comments that avoided taking any real position, as I smiled politely while Victoria discussed her latest charity project, I felt something different. Not anger, exactly, though there was some of that. Not sadness, though the waste of all these years weighed heavily on my chest. What I felt was clarity. The cold, sharp understanding that this world I'd been trying so hard to fit into had never been designed to include me as anything more than a supporting role.
Character. My father caught my eye across the table and nodded slightly, as if he could read my thoughts. Thursday was 2 days away. The envelope was waiting in my apartment, and everything was about to change in ways that none of them could imagine. But for tonight, I played my part perfectly. The grateful daughter, the hard-working employee, the supporting character who knew her place and stayed in her assigned role. Because sometimes the best strategy is to let people underestimate you right up until the moment you prove them completely wrong. The phone call came at 6 in the morning on a Wednesday, 3 weeks before everything changed forever. I was barely awake, fumbling for my coffee maker in the pre-dawn darkness of my Capitol Hill apartment, when my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and completely unexpected. "Miss Chen? This is Jennifer Walsh from Seattle Children's Hospital. I'm calling about the donation your father made to our new pediatric wing. He specified that all correspondence should go through you rather than the main Chen Industries office." I stood there in my pajamas, holding the phone and trying to process what she just said. My father had been making charitable donations through me without telling me? "I'm sorry," I said slowly. "I think there might be some confusion. I don't handle charitable giving for the company." There was a pause, and I could hear papers rustling on her end. "According to our records, Richard Chen established the Maya Chen Charitable Foundation 18 months ago. You're listed as the primary contact and decision maker for all distributions. We have documentation showing donations totaling over $2 million to various organizations throughout the Seattle area." $2 million. In my name. For 18 months. Jennifer Walsh continued talking about tax documentation and foundation paperwork, but I'd stopped listening. I was thinking about all the times over the past year and a half when my father had asked seemingly casual questions about which charities I supported, which causes mattered most to me, what I thought about different approaches to community investment. At the time, I'd assumed he was making conversation, maybe testing my knowledge about corporate social responsibility. Now I realized he'd been building something. In my name, with my values, using my preferences as the foundation for decisions worth millions of dollars. After I hung up with Jennifer, I sat on my couch staring at the wall and trying to understand what was happening. The envelope my father had given me was locked in the safety deposit box, unread. But clearly, whatever it contained was part of a much larger plan that had been in motion for years. I called in sick to work that day. For the first time in 7 years at Chen Industries, I used a personal day to deal with personal business. I spent the morning at the bank, using the key my father had given me to access the safety deposit box I'd never known existed. Inside, along with the sealed envelope, were documents that made my head spin. Legal papers establishing the Maya Chen Charitable Foundation. Trust documents with my name on them. Stock certificates for companies I'd never heard of. Bank statements showing accounts with balances that had more zeros than I'd ever seen in one place. The envelope itself was thick, maybe 20 pages, sealed with wax that bore my father's initials. Written across the front in his careful handwriting were the words, "For Maya Elizabeth Chen, when she's ready to inherit what was always meant to be hers." I didn't open it, not yet. Something told me that once I broke that seal, there would be no going back to the simple version of my life where I was just the family disappointment trying to prove herself worthy of basic respect. Instead, I drove to the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. Dr. Elizabeth Warren met me in the same private room where I'd spoken with my father 3 weeks earlier. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe early 40s, with the kind of calm competence that probably helped families navigate the worst moments of their lives. "Your father told me you might come," she said without preamble. "He wanted me to answer any questions you might have about his condition and his timeline." "How long does he really have?" She consulted a file that seemed too thin to contain information about someone's entire future. "Pancreatic cancer is unpredictable, but based on his current progression in response to treatment, we're looking at weeks rather than months, maybe 6 to 8 weeks at the outside." 6 to 8 weeks. I'd known he was dying, but hearing it quantified made it real in a way that hit like physical pain.
He's been asking about you, Dr. Warren continued, about how you're handling everything. He seems very concerned about making sure you're prepared for what's coming. Prepared for what exactly? She smiled gently. That's not medical information, Miss Chen. That's something you'll need to discuss with your father. That evening, I called him, not the house line where Patricia might answer, but his private cell phone that only family and close business associates had access to. Maya, he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice. I was wondering when you'd call. I went to the bank today. I saw the foundation paperwork, the trust documents. Dad, what have you been doing? Preparing, he said simply, for a future where the right person makes the right decisions for the right reasons. Everyone thinks Derek is going to inherit the company. Everyone thinks a lot of things that aren't necessarily true. Derek will inherit exactly what he's earned, which is a comfortable living and a respected position. But the controlling interest in Chen Industries, Maya, that's something different entirely. The words hung between us like a bridge I was afraid to cross. I don't know if I can do what you're asking, I said quietly. I'm not asking you to be me. I'm asking you to be you, with the authority to make it count. The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock in the executive conference room on the 30th floor of the Columbia Center. I'd worked in the same building for 7 years and had never been that high up on an elevator. The elevator ride felt endless, each floor marking my passage into territory I'd never been invited to explore. The conference room was exactly what I'd imagined. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a table that could seat 20 people but somehow made the 12 board members look small and scattered. Everyone was already there when I arrived, their conversations stopping abruptly when I walked through the door. Derek sat at my father's right hand, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, and the expression of someone who belonged exactly where he was. Robert Steinberg occupied the chair across from
him, flanked by Margaret Ashford and 2 other board members whose names I knew but had never spoken to personally. Marcus was there too, looking uncomfortable, but trying to project the confidence that came with being a Chen. My father had saved a seat for me, 3 chairs down from Derek on the same side of the table. Not prominent, but not hidden either. Visible to everyone, but positioned in a way that suggested I was there to observe rather than participate. Thank you all for coming, my father began once I'd taken my seat. I've called this meeting to discuss some significant changes to the structure and leadership of Chen Industries. Derek straightened slightly, the subtle movement of someone preparing to accept applause. This was the moment he'd been groomed for his entire adult life, the formal transition of power from father to eldest son, the validation of everything he'd believed about his place in the world. As you know, my father continued, Chen Industries has grown significantly over the past decade. We now own properties in 6 states, employ over 3,000 people, and manage assets worth approximately $2.8 billion. He paused to let the numbers settle in the room. Even after all these years, the scope of what he'd built was impressive enough to make people pay attention. The continued success of this company requires leadership that understands not just how to maintain what we've built, but how to transform it for the challenges ahead. Leadership that combines business acumen with genuine understanding of our workforce, our communities, and our long-term obligations to both. Derek's smile was confident, assured. These were exactly the kinds of qualities he'd been demonstrating in his role as executive vice president. Robert nodded approvingly, clearly anticipating the announcement they'd all been expecting. Which is why, my father said, and his voice grew stronger, I'm announcing today that controlling interest in Chen Industries will be transferred to Maya Chen, effective immediately upon my death. The silence that followed was complete. Not just quiet, but utterly without sound, as if the room itself had stopped breathing. I felt 12 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and for a moment I couldn't tell if the expressions I saw were confusion, shock, or outright disbelief. Derek's face went through a sequence of emotions so quickly I almost missed them. Surprise, confusion, denial, and then something darker that he tried to cover with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm sorry, he said, and his voice was carefully controlled. Did you say Maya?
I did. My father's tone was calm, matter of fact, as if he'd just announced a routine quarterly report rather than completely upending everything everyone in the room believed about the future. Robert cleared his throat. Richard, I think we need to discuss this. Maya has no experience in executive leadership. She's been working in residential development for 7 years. She's never run a department, never managed a major project, never even attended a board meeting before today. That's correct, he replied. She's also increased profitability in every project she's managed, identified cost-saving measures that have saved the company over $3 million in the past 2 years, and demonstrated the kind of long-term strategic thinking that suggests she understands this business better than people who have been making assumptions about her capabilities. Margaret Ashford leaned forward. Richard, we all respect Maya, but surely you can see that this is unexpected. Jarek has been preparing for this role his entire career. He has the relationships, the experience, the knowledge base to step into leadership immediately. Derek has been preparing for the role he believed he was entitled to, my father said, and there was steel in his voice now. Maya has been preparing for the role she was actually being trained for, whether she realized it or not. I found my voice for the first time since entering the room. I need everyone to understand that I had no idea about this decision until very recently. This isn't something I lobbied for or expected. Derek turned to look at me directly, and his expression was unreadable. Maya, you can't seriously be considering this. You have to know you're not ready for this kind of responsibility. The words stung, because part of me agreed with them. Part of me had been thinking the same thing since my father first hinted at what he was planning. But sitting in that room, surrounded by people who had spent years treating me like an afterthought, something shifted inside me. You're right, I said quietly. I'm not ready to be the person you think should run this company, but maybe that's exactly why I'm the right choice. My father smiled for the first time since the meeting began. The transition will be gradual. Maya will begin taking on expanded responsibilities immediately, working closely with me to understand the aspects of company leadership that haven't been part of her previous role. Derek will continue as executive vice president, and his experience will be invaluable during this transition period. The meeting continued for another hour, covering legal details and implementation timelines and succession planning that made my head spin. But I barely heard most of it. I was too busy watching the faces around the table, seeing the calculations happening behind carefully neutral expressions. Some of them were clearly trying to process the idea that everything they'd assumed about the company's future was wrong. Others seemed to be weighing their options, considering how to position themselves in a world where the quiet daughter suddenly held all the power. And Derek? Derek was being perfectly professional, asking thoughtful questions and offering constructive suggestions about transition logistics. But I could see something else underneath the surface, something that looked like the moment when someone realizes they've been playing a completely different game than they thought.
To help an opponent understand the rules while already planning their next several moves. I'd appreciate that, I said, because refusing would have seemed ungracious and suspicious. Great! Let's plan on dinner this weekend. Just family, nice and casual. Patricia will want to celebrate your promotion properly. After he left, I stood alone in the conference room looking out at the city spread below. Somewhere down there was my little apartment, my small projects, my simple life that had just become infinitely more complicated. My father appeared beside me, moving more slowly than he had even a week ago. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Terrified," I said honestly, and confused, and like I might throw up. He laughed, a sound I hadn't heard from him in months. "Good. Those are the right feelings for someone who's about to take on something bigger than themselves." "Dad, what if I can't do this? What if everyone's right and I'm not ready?" He was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the water and the mountains beyond. "When I bought my first property," he said finally, "I spent the entire first night sitting in the empty building wondering what the hell I'd gotten myself into.
I was convinced I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. But you know what I realized? I waited for him to continue. Nobody's ever ready for the thing that will define them. You become ready by doing it, by making mistakes and learning from them, by discovering capabilities you didn't know you had. He turned to look at me directly. Maya, I'm not giving you this company because I think you're already perfect for the job. I'm giving it to you because I believe you'll grow into it in ways that will make it better than I ever could have made it alone. That evening, I sat in my apartment with the still unopened envelope on my coffee table. I now knew what it contained, at least in broad terms. Legal documents that would formalize my inheritance, instructions for managing the transition, probably advice about how to handle the family dynamics that were about to become much more complicated. But I also knew that opening it would make everything real in a way that a board meeting announcement couldn't. Once I read whatever my father had written, once I understood the full scope of what he was giving me, there would be no pretending this was all a misunderstanding that would somehow resolve itself. Instead, I called Sarah. I need to ask you something, I said when she answered, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Okay? Do you think I can do this? Do you think I can actually run Chen Industries? She was quiet for so long I thought the call might have dropped. Maya, she said finally, I've been watching you work for 8 years. I've seen how you handle problems, how you treat people, how you think about solutions. And I've also been watching Derek work for the same 8 years. Another pause. Derek's good at his job. He's confident, he has great instincts for big-picture strategy, and he knows how to work a room. But Maya, he's never had to prove himself the way you have. He's never had to work twice as hard for half the recognition. He's never had to be right more often because being wrong would cost him everything. That doesn't mean I'm ready to run $1 billion company. No, she agreed. But it means you're ready to learn how, and honestly, that might be more important than being ready from day one. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat staring at the envelope. Tomorrow, I would start my new life as the heir to Chen Industries. Derek would begin adjusting to a reality he'd never imagined. Patricia would have to reconcile herself to a world where the stepdaughter she'd always dismissed suddenly held more power than her biological son. And somewhere in the middle of all that, I would have to figure out how to become the person my father believed I could be. But for tonight, I was still Maya Chen, the unwanted mistake who lived in a tiny apartment and drove a 7-year-old Honda and measured success in small victories on residential development projects. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, I allowed myself one last evening of being underestimated by everyone, including myself. The family dinner at Derek's Bellevue mansion the following Saturday was orchestrated with the precision of a military campaign. Victoria had outdone herself, transforming their already impressive dining room into something that belonged in a design magazine. Crystal stemware caught the light from an enormous chandelier, while cream-colored roses spilled from silver vases positioned strategically around the room. The table setting alone probably cost more than my monthly rent, and everything about the evening screamed celebration and acceptance. But beneath the surface elegance, I could feel the tension humming like electricity before a storm. Derek greeted me at the door with an embrace that felt both genuine and calculated, the kind of hug that would look perfect in family photos while allowing him to whisper in my ear, "We need to talk privately after dinner. There are some things you need to understand about running this company." Patricia arrived 20 minutes later, her silver hair perfectly styled and her smile bright enough to power the entire house. She kissed my cheek with more warmth than she'd shown me in years, her hands lingering on my shoulders as she pulled back to study my face. "Maya, darling, you look absolutely radiant. Success suits you so well." The transformation was remarkable. The woman who had spent years treating me like an inconvenient house guest was now looking at me like I'd personally hung the moon. It would have been flattering if it hadn't been so obviously tied to my newfound status as the heir to billions of dollars. Marcus showed up with a bottle of champagne that probably cost more than most people's car payments, his usual casual demeanor replaced by something more attentive, more deliberate. Even Victoria, who had perfected the art of sweet condescension over the years we'd known each other, seemed to have discovered new depths of interest in my opinions and experiences. "Maya, you simply must tell us everything about your plans for the company. Derek has been so excited about working with you in this new capacity." The conversation that followed was a masterclass in family politics. Everyone asked thoughtful questions about my vision for Chen Industries' future. They listened attentively when I spoke, nodding and making encouraging sounds at all the right moments. Derek offered insights and suggestions with the generous enthusiasm of a mentor eager to share his expertise with a promising protege. It was perfect. It was supportive. It was exactly what a loving family should be,
Should do when one of their own received an unexpected promotion. And it was completely, obviously fake. I could see the calculation behind every smile, the strategy behind every question. They were probing, testing, trying to understand what kind of leader I might become and how they could position themselves to maintain their influence. Patricia's sudden warmth was designed to secure her place as trusted advisor to the new CEO. Marcus's attentiveness was aimed at ensuring his trust fund remained secure. Victoria's interest in my opinions was really interest in how her lifestyle might be affected by having a sister-in-law who suddenly controlled the family fortune. But Derek's performance was the most sophisticated of all. He played the role of supportive older brother perfectly, offering guidance and encouragement while subtly establishing himself as the experienced executive who would be essential to my success. Every suggestion he made was framed as helpful advice. Every question he asked was positioned as concern for my well-being and the company's future. "You know, Maya," he said over the main course, cutting into his perfectly prepared lamb with surgical precision, "there's so much institutional knowledge that doesn't exist in any manual or training program. Relationships with clients that took years to build, understanding of market dynamics that only comes from experience, insight into how different departments really function behind the official organizational charts." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "Derek's absolutely right. You'll need all the support you can get as you transition into this new role." "Of course," I said carefully. "I'm grateful for any guidance you can offer." Derek smiled, the expression of someone who just won a small but important victory. "I was thinking we should set up regular meetings, maybe twice a week to start. I can walk you through the key relationships, introduce you to the major players, help you understand the nuances of different deals and partnerships." It sounded reasonable. It sounded helpful. It sounded like exactly what a new CEO would need from an experienced executive. It also sounded like a way to ensure that every major decision I made would be filtered through Derek's interpretation of what was appropriate, wise, or politically feasible. "That's very generous," I said. "I'll definitely want to take advantage of your experience as I learn the ropes." The smile that passed between Derek and Patricia was brief but unmistakable. They thought they'd successfully managed the crisis. The unwanted stepdaughter might have inherited the crown, but they would make sure she understood who really knew how to wear it. After dinner, Derek suggested we take our coffee in his study while the others relaxed in the living room. His home office was a smaller version of our father's, complete with expensive furniture and carefully chosen artwork that projected success and authority. He gestured for me to take the chair across from his desk, a positioning that immediately established the dynamic he wanted for our conversation.
Maya, he began, settling into his chair with the comfortable confidence of someone addressing a subordinate, I want you to know how proud I am of you. This opportunity is incredible, and I know you're going to do great things with it. The words were perfect, supportive, encouraging, exactly what a good brother should say. But the tone carried something else underneath, something that sounded almost like pity. Thank you, I said simply. I also want you to know that I understand how overwhelming this must feel. When Dad first started talking about succession planning, I went through the same thing. The weight of responsibility, the fear of making mistakes that could affect thousands of people, the pressure of living up to a legacy that took decades to build. He leaned forward slightly, his expression shifting to one of concerned sincerity. That's why I think it's so important for us to work closely together during this transition. You don't have to figure everything out on your own, Maya. You have a brother who's been preparing for this kind of responsibility his entire career. There it was, the gentle reminder that this should have been his job, wrapped in an offer of assistance that would ensure it effectively remained his job. I appreciate that, Derek, really. But I think it's important for me to find my own way of leading, even if that means making some mistakes along the way. His smile flickered, just for a moment, before returning to its previous warmth. Of course, independence is important. But Maya, you have to understand that this isn't just about you anymore. Every decision you make affects the entire company, all our employees, every family that depends on Shen Industries for their livelihood. The weight he placed on those words was unmistakable. The subtle suggestion that my inexperience could hurt innocent people. The implication that refusing his guidance would be selfish and potentially destructive. I'm very aware of that responsibility, I said quietly. Good, good. That's exactly what I hoped you'd say. He reached for a folder on his desk and handed it to me. I've put together some preliminary thoughts about priority areas for your first few months. Client relationships that need immediate attention, internal projects that are at critical stages, strategic decisions that can't be delayed while you get up to speed. I opened the folder and found a detailed timeline that essentially mapped out my entire first year as CEO. Client meetings scheduled, project priorities ranked, strategic initiatives outlined with specific implementation dates. It was comprehensive, thoughtful, and completely removed any actual decision-making authority from my hands. That's very thorough, I said, flipping through pages of charts and recommendations. I wanted to make sure you felt supported, Derek replied. The last thing I'd want is for you to feel like you're drowning in responsibilities you weren't prepared for. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Derek outlining his vision for how we could work together to ensure a smooth transition. He was careful to frame everything in terms of my success and the company's well-being, but the underlying message was clear. Stay in your lane, follow my guidance, and let the adults handle the real decisions. When I finally left Derek's house that night, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. The evening had been a revelation, but not in the way my family intended. I'd just watched 4 people who had spent years treating me like an afterthought suddenly discover deep reserves of affection and concern for my well-being. I'd seen them coordinate their approach to managing me with the same strategic thinking they'd use for any other business challenge. And most importantly, I'd realized that they weren't going to make this easy. They might have been forced to accept my father's decision, but they had no intention of allowing me to actually exercise it.
Actually, allowing me to lead. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, introductions, and barely concealed attempts to undermine my authority before I'd even officially taken over. Derek followed through on his promise to provide guidance, scheduling regular sessions where he walked me through client relationships and company dynamics. But each conversation felt more like indoctrination than education, designed to convince me that his way of doing things was the only viable approach. Patricia began calling me regularly, ostensibly to check on how I was adjusting to my new responsibilities.
But her questions always seemed to focus on whether I was finding the job as difficult as she'd expected, whether I was reconsidering any of my father's decisions, whether I might want to delegate more authority to people with greater experience. Even Marcus, who had largely stayed out of family politics for years, suddenly developed strong opinions about company strategy and the importance of maintaining continuity during leadership transitions. But it was Robert Steinberg who proved to be the most direct in his opposition. 2 weeks after the board meeting, he requested a private lunch to discuss some concerns about the transition timeline. We met at the Columbia Tower Club, the exclusive restaurant on the 76th floor where Seattle's business elite gathered to make deals and share gossip. Robert had chosen the location deliberately, I realized, someplace where other executives and board members might overhear our conversation and draw their own conclusions about my fitness for leadership. "Maya," he said, once we'd ordered, his tone carrying the patronizing warmth of someone addressing a child who'd gotten in over their head, "I want to be honest with you about some challenges I'm seeing." I waited for him to continue, keeping my expression neutral. "The fact is, there are board members who are concerned about your readiness for this role, not because they don't respect you personally, but because executive leadership requires a specific skill set that typically takes years to develop." He paused to sip his wine, letting the weight of his words settle between us. "I've been thinking about potential solutions that might address these concerns while still honoring your father's wishes. What if we structured things so that you maintain the title of CEO, but worked with a chief operating officer who could handle the day-to-day operational decisions? Someone with the experience and relationships necessary to ensure continuity during your learning period." The suggestion was presented as a compromise, a reasonable solution that would benefit everyone involved. But I understood exactly what he was proposing: a figurehead CEO position that would allow me to inherit the company in name while someone else actually ran it. "That's an interesting idea," I said carefully. "Who did you have in mind for the COO position?" Robert's smile was answer enough. "Well, Derek would be the obvious choice. He has the relationships, the experience, the institutional knowledge. It would be a natural evolution of his current role as executive vice president." There it was, the family's real plan. If they couldn't prevent my inheritance, they would structure it so that Derek maintained functional control while I served as a ceremonial leader. It was elegant, politically defensible, and would effectively nullify everything my father had tried to accomplish. "I appreciate the suggestion," I said carefully, "but I think it's important for me to grow into the full responsibilities of leadership rather than have them managed for me." Robert's expression shifted slightly, the friendly advisor mask slipping just enough to reveal something harder underneath. "Maya, I'm going to be very frank with you. There are people in this company, board members and major clients, who are not convinced that Richard made the right decision. They're watching very carefully to see whether you can actually handle this job." The threat was politely delivered but unmistakable. Step out of line, refuse to accept the limitations they wanted to impose, and they would move to have me removed from leadership entirely. "I understand," I said quietly, "and I appreciate your honesty." "Good. I hope we can work together to find a structure that makes everyone comfortable." That evening, I finally opened the envelope my father had given me. Inside were legal documents, as I'd expected, but also a letter written in his careful handwriting that made me understand for the first time exactly what kind of war I was walking into. "Maya," it began, "if you're reading this, then the board meeting has happened, and you now understand what I've been planning. You're probably feeling overwhelmed, maybe frightened, certainly pressured by people who want to convince you that you're not ready for this responsibility. They're not wrong about the challenges ahead, but they're completely wrong about your ability to handle them. What they see as inexperience, I see as fresh perspective. What they call naivety, I call integrity. What they dismiss as softness, I recognize the kind of strength that builds lasting success rather than short-term profits. But Maya, you need to understand that they will not make this easy for you. Derek will try to position himself as indispensable to your success while gradually taking over all meaningful decision-making authority. Patricia will attempt to use emotional manipulation to convince you that family harmony requires you to defer to Derek's superior experience. Robert and others on the board will create situations designed to make you fail, then use those failures as justification for removing you from leadership entirely. They will be patient, strategic, and relentless. They will frame every challenge to your authority as concern for your well-being or the company's future. They will make you doubt yourself, question your instincts, and wonder whether they might be right about your limitations. Don't let them. You are my daughter, Maya, and you have earned this inheritance through years of proving yourself in ways they never bothered to notice. You understand this business from the ground up. You care about our employees and our communities in ways that Derek never has and never will. You have the intelligence, the work ethic, and the integrity to transform Chen Industries into something better than I ever imagined. But you will have to fight for it. And when the fighting gets hardest, when the pressure becomes almost unbearable, remember that I chose you, not betide your differences from them, but because of them. The company's future and the future of everyone who depends on it is in your hands now. Don't let anyone convince you to give that responsibility to someone else. All my love and all my faith, Dad. I read the letter 3 times before the full impact hit me. My father hadn't just given me a company, he'd given me a battlefield, and he knew exactly what kind of opposition I would face from the very beginning.
People who should have been supporting me. The next morning, I walked into Chen Industries with a different understanding of my situation. The smiles and offers of assistance I'd been receiving weren't attempts to help me succeed. They were attempts to control me, to limit my authority, to ensure that the real power remained exactly where it had always been. But I also walked in with something I'd never had before: absolute certainty that I belonged there. 3 weeks later, my father died peacefully in his sleep at the Mercer Island estate. The funeral was everything you'd expect for a man who'd built an empire from nothing. Hundreds of mourners, speeches from business leaders and politicians, enough flowers to fill a greenhouse. The entire Seattle business community turned out to pay their respects to Richard Chen, the self-made billionaire who'd transformed the city's skyline and provided jobs for thousands of people. But for me, the most meaningful moment came at the end of the service, when James Liu, my father's attorney for 30 years, approached me with a small envelope. "He asked me to give you this after the funeral," James said quietly. "He wanted you to have it before the will reading tomorrow." Inside was a single sentence in my father's handwriting. "Now show them what you're really capable of."
Company's stability. His specific complaint was my decision to restructure our residential development division, promoting Sarah Martinez to Vice President of Operations and bringing in new project managers who prioritize sustainable building practices over maximum profit margins. "Maya's making fundamental changes without proper consultation," Derek told the assembled board members, his voice carrying the perfect balance of concern and disappointment. "These aren't the kind of experimental policies we can afford to implement during a transition period. We need steady leadership, not untested theories about corporate responsibility." I had expected this moment, had prepared for it since reading my father's letter. When Derek finished his presentation about the risks of my impulsive decision-making, I stood up and walked to the presentation screen at the front of the room. "Derek's right about one thing," I said, advancing to the first slide of my own prepared presentation. I am making fundamental changes, but they're not experimental, and they're certainly not impulsive. For the next 40 minutes, I presented a comprehensive analysis of Chen Industries' position in the current market, complete with projections showing how sustainable development practices would position us ahead of inevitable regulatory changes and shifting consumer preferences. I detailed the financial benefits of the restructuring Derek was criticizing, including cost savings and efficiency improvements that would increase profitability by 18% over the next 2 years. But most importantly, I presented information that Derek didn't know I had access to. Financial records showing that his own division had been underperforming for the past 18 months, masking declining profits through accounting techniques that were legal but misleading. Contract details revealing that several of his major client relationships were far less secure than he'd represented to the board. The question, I concluded, isn't whether I'm ready to lead this company. The question is whether we're ready to compete in a market that's already changing around us, while some of our executives are still fighting yesterday's battles. The silence that followed was different from the shocked quiet that had greeted my father's original announcement. This was the silence of people recalculating, reassessing, realizing that they had seriously misjudged the person sitting at the head of the table. Robert Steinberg cleared his throat. Maya, this is very impressive work, very thorough. But I think Derek's concern is about the pace of change rather than the direction. Perhaps a more gradual implementation? With respect, Robert, I interrupted, and my voice carried an authority that surprised even me. Gradual implementation is how companies lose market position while their competitors adapt faster. Dad built this empire by moving quickly when he saw opportunities. I intend to do the same. Derek's face had gone through several shades of red during my presentation, but he maintained his composure with the skill of someone who'd spent years in high-stakes business meetings. Maya, I appreciate the research you've done, but experience teaches you that numbers on paper don't always translate to real-world success. There are relationships to consider, institutional knowledge that can't be quantified in a presentation. You're absolutely right, I agreed, which is why I spent the past month meeting personally with every major client, every department head, and every project manager in the company. Would you like to hear what they told me? Derek's confident smile faltered slightly. I advanced to the next section of slides, which detailed feedback from client meetings Derek assumed I'd never attended, insights from employees he didn't know I'd spoken with, and market intelligence gathered from sources he'd never bothered to cultivate. It turns out, I said, that institutional knowledge works both ways. While you were focused on maintaining existing relationships, I was building new ones. While you were protecting established processes, I was identifying opportunities for improvement that people throughout the company have been waiting years for someone to notice. The board meeting ended with a unanimous vote of confidence in my leadership and a directive for all executive staff to support the restructuring initiatives I'd outlined. Derek left the room without speaking to me, his face carrying the expression of someone who had just realized that the game had completely changed. But the real test came 2 days later when Patricia called to request a private lunch at the Columbia Tower Club, the same venue where Robert had tried to convince me to accept a figurehead CEO position she'd chosen for what I suspected would be her final attempt to reclaim control through emotional manipulation. She arrived looking impeccable, as always. Her silver hair perfectly styled and her designer suit chosen to project both sophistication and maternal authority. We exchanged pleasantries about the weather and the restaurant's renovation before she got to the real purpose of our meeting. Maya, darling, I've been so worried about you since the board meeting. This level of stress can't be healthy for someone your age. I waited for her to continue, sipping my water and maintaining the polite attention I'd perfected during years of similar conversations. I know you feel like you need to prove yourself, but sweetheart, you're pushing too hard, making enemies of people who should be your allies. Derek is devastated by what happened in that meeting. He's only trying to help, you know. I'm sure he is, I replied neutrally. He loves you, Maya. We all do. But love sometimes means telling someone when they're making mistakes that could hurt them. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes glistening with what appeared to be genuine concern. This crusade you're on, trying to change everything your father built, it's going to destroy the family. There it was, the central weapon in Patricia's arsenal, refined through years of use. The suggestion that any action that didn't defer to Derek's preferences was somehow a betrayal of family unity and my father's memory. Patricia, I said calmly, I want you to understand something very clearly. The changes I'm making aren't a crusade or a rebellion. They're the natural evolution of a company that needs to adapt to survive. Dad understood that, which is why he chose me to lead, rather than someone who would simply maintain the status quo. Her expression shifted slightly, the maternal concern giving way to something harder. Your father made that decision when he was very sick, darling, when he wasn't thinking clearly about the long-term consequences. If he had had more time, if he had been able to see how disruptive these changes
Would be, he'd be proud of exactly what I'm accomplishing, I finished. Patricia, I know you mean well, but I need you to understand that the company's direction isn't up for family discussion anymore. I'm the CEO, I'm the controlling shareholder, and these decisions are mine to make. The facade of maternal concern finally cracked completely. You ungrateful little girl, she snapped, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. After everything this family has given you, after all the opportunities you've had because of the Chen name, you're willing to destroy it all just to prove some petty point about being taken seriously? I felt something cold and clear settle in my chest. For 29 years, I'd been trying to earn acceptance from people who had never intended to give it. I'd been seeking approval from individuals who saw my very existence as an inconvenience to their perfectly ordered world. You're right about one thing, Patricia, I said, my voice steady and calm. I am ungrateful. I'm ungrateful for years of being treated like a charity case in my own family. I'm ungrateful for the privilege of working twice as hard for half the recognition. I'm ungrateful for the opportunity to smile politely while you and Derek discussed my limitations as if I weren't sitting right there. I stood up, placing my napkin on the table with deliberate care. But mostly, I'm ungrateful that it took my father's death for me to realize that I don't need your acceptance to succeed. I never did. Walking away from that lunch felt like shedding a weight I'd been carrying for decades. The fear of disappointing them, the hope of eventually earning their respect, the constant anxiety about whether I was good enough to belong in their world, all of it fell away, leaving something lighter and infinitely stronger in its place. The months that followed were a masterclass in the difference between management and leadership. Derek continued to fulfill his duties as executive vice president, but our working relationship became strictly professional. He provided reports when requested, attended meetings when summoned, and offered input when asked. But gone were the attempts to guide my decisions or position himself as indispensable to my success. Patricia maintained her residence at the Mercer Island estate, but stopped calling with advice about company strategy or family obligations. Our interactions became limited to brief, polite exchanges at necessary family gatherings, marked by the careful courtesy of two people who had finally acknowledged they would never be friends. Robert Steinberg proved more adaptable than I'd expected. After the board meeting where I'd demonstrated my preparation and strategic thinking, he seemed to recalibrate his approach entirely. He became a valuable advisor, offering insights based on his decades of experience while respecting my authority to make final decisions. It was a professional relationship built on mutual respect, rather than family politics. And it worked far better than the dynamic he'd tried to establish initially. But the most significant transformation was in how the company itself responded to leadership that actually led. Department heads who had spent years waiting for approval to implement efficiency improvements suddenly found themselves with the authority and resources to innovate. Project managers who had been constrained by "that's how we've always done it" discovered they were encouraged to find better solutions. Employees throughout the organization began contributing ideas and taking initiative in ways that increased both productivity and job satisfaction. The financial results spoke for themselves. 6 months after taking over,
Chen Industries posted the highest quarterly profits in company history. Our sustainable development initiatives had attracted new clients who valued environmental responsibility, while our operational improvements had reduced costs across all divisions. The stock value of our privately held company, estimated by independent evaluators, had increased by 32%. But beyond the numbers, something more important had changed. The culture of the organization had shifted from one of cautious preservation to active growth. People throughout the company began thinking like owners rather than employees, contributing not just their time, but their creativity and passion to building something better than what had existed before. The success didn't go unnoticed in Seattle's business community. The same executives and board members who had questioned my readiness 6 months earlier began seeking my input on their own strategic challenges. Industry publications ran features about Chen Industries' transformation under new leadership. Professional organizations extended invitations for me to speak about sustainable business practices and family succession planning. Most satisfying of all was the day Marcus called to ask if I'd consider investing Chen Industries' resources in his venture capital firm's latest fund. The brother who had spent years maintaining careful distance from family business dynamics suddenly saw value in associating his professional reputation with mine. Maya, I have to admit, I didn't see this coming. What you've accomplished in 6 months is remarkable. Thank you, I said, genuinely pleased by his acknowledgement. I've been thinking a lot about Dad's decision, about why he chose you instead of Derek. At the time, I thought maybe it was sentiment or guilt about how you'd been treated growing up, but now I understand it was pure business sense. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. Derek's good at managing what exists. You're good at creating what should exist. Dad knew the company needed someone who could build on what he had started rather than just maintain it. The recognition from Marcus mattered more than I'd expected. Unlike Derek and Patricia, he had no direct stake in my success or failure. His assessment was based purely on results, which made his acknowledgement feel completely genuine. But perhaps the most meaningful moment came on a rainy Thursday evening 6 months after my father's death, when I was working late in my office and found myself thinking about the conversation we'd had at the cancer center. His words about being chosen, not despite my differences, but because of them. His faith that I could transform the company into something better than he had imagined. I walked to the window overlooking Elliott Bay and realized that the view looked different than it had when I was the unwanted mistake working in residential development. Not because the landscape had changed, but because I was seeing it from a position of strength rather than insecurity. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, who had thrived in her new role as vice president of operations and become my most trusted advisor.
Well, the Spokane expansion proposal passed unanimously. You're building something amazing here, Maya. I smiled, thinking about how far we'd both come from our days of whispered conversations in supply closets and coffee shops. Sarah had been right when she'd told me that being ready to learn might be more important than being ready from day one. But she'd been wrong about one thing. I hadn't just learned how to run Chen Industries. I'd learned how to become the person I was always meant to be. The company my father built had been impressive, a testament to his vision and determination, but the organization I was building would be something more. A place where success was measured not just in quarterly profits, but in long-term sustainability, where leadership meant empowering others rather than controlling them, where the next generation of employees could thrive regardless of their background or family connections. Standing in that office, looking out at the city lights reflected in the dark water of the bay, I understood, finally, that the real inheritance my father had given me wasn't the company itself. It was the opportunity to prove that the qualities he'd seen in me, the ones Derek and Patricia and Robert had dismissed as weaknesses, were actually the foundation for a different kind of strength. They had called me the unwanted mistake, the family disappointment who got lucky through circumstances beyond her control. But in the end, I'd become something they never expected and could never take away. The rightful heir who had earned her place by transforming everything she touched into something better than anyone thought possible. The empire was mine now, but more importantly, it was exactly where it belonged. 2 years after becoming CEO of Chen Industries, I received an invitation that would have been unimaginable during my days as the overlooked daughter working in residential development.
The Seattle Business Journal wanted to feature me on their cover as Executive of the Year, recognizing what they called the most remarkable corporate transformation in Pacific Northwest history. The irony wasn't lost on me that the same publication had once run a brief mention of Derek as a rising star in commercial development, while never acknowledging my existence despite 7 years of consistent performance in the company. The photographer arranged the shoot in my office, positioning me behind the mahogany desk that had once belonged to my father. As I sat there in a tailored navy suit that cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 6 months, I thought about how many assumptions had been shattered to bring me to this moment. Not just assumptions about my capabilities, but fundamental beliefs about what leadership looked like, how family businesses should operate, and whether someone who'd spent years being underestimated could transform into someone who commanded respect on a national level. Chen Industries had grown beyond anyone's expectations, including my own. The sustainable development initiatives I'd implemented weren't just environmentally responsible. They'd become a competitive advantage that attracted clients from across the country. Our employee satisfaction scores had reached levels that business schools now used as case studies. The company's valuation had increased by 140%, making it one of the fastest-growing private enterprises in the region. But the numbers, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real transformation had been cultural, turning an organization built on hierarchy and tradition into one driven by innovation and inclusivity. Employees who had spent years keeping their heads down and following established procedures now brought forward ideas that revolutionized how we approached everything, from client relations to community development. Department heads who had previously competed for resources and recognition began collaborating on cross-functional projects that benefited the entire organization. The success had attracted attention beyond Seattle's business community. I'd been invited to speak at conferences from Vancouver to San Diego, sharing insights about sustainable business practices and succession planning in family enterprises. Harvard Business School had requested permission to develop a case study about Chen Industries' transformation, focusing on how leadership style could fundamentally alter organizational culture and performance. Most remarkably, other family-owned businesses began reaching out for consultation about their own succession challenges. Sons and daughters who felt trapped in roles that didn't match their strengths, patriarchs and matriarchs struggling to identify the right heir among multiple candidates, siblings caught in power struggles that threatened to destroy what previous generations had built. They came to me because I'd navigated territory they recognized, the complex intersection of family dynamics and business requirements that could either strengthen or shatter everything that mattered. During one particularly memorable consultation with a San Francisco hotel chain, the founder's daughter described her situation in terms that could have been lifted from my own experience 2 years ago. "Everyone assumes my older brother will take over," she said, "but he's never shown interest in anything except for the financial returns. Meanwhile, I've been working in operations for 8 years, implementing improvements that have saved the company millions, and nobody notices because it's not flashy enough to get attention." I found myself giving her the advice I wish someone had given me years earlier. Stop waiting for them to notice your value and start demonstrating it in ways they can't ignore. Build your own track record, develop your own relationships, and when the opportunity comes, be ready to prove you deserve it. 6 months later, she sent me a message with a photo from her own business journal cover story, having successfully taken over leadership of her family's company after presenting a strategic plan that impressed their board of directors enough to override traditional succession expectations. These experiences taught me that my journey from unwanted mistake to successful CEO wasn't unique in its challenges, only in its outcome. Family businesses across the country were struggling with similar dynamics, capable family members being overlooked because they didn't fit traditional leadership profiles, organizations suffering because succession decisions were based on birth order rather than competence, innovative thinkers being sidelined by relatives who prioritize maintaining the status quo over adapting to changing markets. But perhaps the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. Derek requested a private meeting in my office, arriving on a Tuesday morning with an expression I'd never seen from him before. Genuine humility mixed with
What looked like respect.
"Maya," he began, settling into the chair across from my desk with none of his usual commanding presence. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." I waited for him to continue, curious about what had prompted this conversation. I've spent the past 2 years watching you transform this company into something Dad never could have imagined. The growth, the innovation, the way employees talk about working here now. It's remarkable. And I've had to face some uncomfortable truths about my own assumptions and behavior. He paused, looking out the window at the Seattle skyline before continuing. I thought Dad made a mistake when he chose you. I was convinced you weren't ready, that you'd need constant guidance, that the company would suffer under inexperienced leadership. I was wrong about all of it. The admission was clearly difficult for him, but his voice carried genuine sincerity rather than the calculated charm he'd used during our early interactions. More than that, I realize now that my attempts to help you transition into leadership were really attempts to maintain control. I couldn't accept that someone I'd always seen as my little sister had been chosen for the role I had assumed was mine by right. Derek, I said gently, you were protecting something you cared about. The company meant as much to you as it did to me. He shook his head. No, that's not entirely true. I cared about the company, but I cared more about my position in it. My identity was tied up in being the heir apparent, the one everyone expected to take over. When that identity was challenged, I responded by trying to undermine you, rather than supporting what was best for the organization. The conversation continued for over an hour, with Derek acknowledging specific instances where he'd acted more from wounded pride than genuine concern for the company's welfare. He talked about the pressure he'd felt from Patricia and Robert to challenge my authority, but also took responsibility for his own choices rather than blaming others for his behavior. I've been thinking about leaving Chen Industries, he said eventually, starting fresh somewhere that I can prove myself on my own merits rather than staying in a role where I'll always be the brother who didn't inherit the crown. The statement surprised me, but as I considered it, I realized it might be exactly what both he and the company needed. What would you want to do? I asked. There's a development firm in Portland that's been courting me for months. They're looking for someone to head up their expansion into sustainable commercial projects. It would be a chance to apply some of the innovations you've implemented here, but in a context where I could build something from the ground up, rather than managing what someone else created. We spent another 30 minutes discussing the opportunity, and I found myself genuinely excited about his prospects. The role would allow him to use his considerable skills in an environment where he could be the visionary leader rather than the supporting executive. It would also eliminate the underlying tension that had marked our working relationship, despite our professional courtesy. Derek, he said as he prepared to leave, I want you to know that if I do take this position, it's not because I'm running away from challenges or avoiding difficult situations. It's because I've finally understood the difference between what I'm entitled to and what I'm suited for. 3 weeks later, Derek accepted the Portland position. His departure was handled with the same professionalism that had marked our interactions since the early confrontations. There was a reception for employees to wish him well, speeches about his contributions to the company, and genuine good wishes for his future success. But the most meaningful moment came during our private goodbye conversation, when he said something that revealed how much both of our perspectives had evolved. You know, Maya, Dad always said the mark of a good leader was knowing when to step aside for someone better. I'm finally learning what he meant. Patricia's response to Derek's departure was more complicated. Without her biological sense presence to anchor her position in the company's power structure, she seemed uncertain about how to relate to me and to the organization that had become the center of my professional life. Our interactions remained polite but distant, marked by the careful courtesy of two people who had learned to coexist without pretending to understand each other. She continued living at the Mercer Island estate, hosting charity events and maintaining the social connections that had always been important to her. But she stopped offering unsolicited advice about company strategy or family dynamics, perhaps finally accepting that I neither needed nor wanted her input on how to manage my responsibilities. The change in our relationship became most apparent during a family dinner 6 months after Derek's departure. Marcus had brought his new girlfriend, a software engineer named Jennifer, who asked thoughtful questions about sustainable development and seemed genuinely interested in the innovations we'd implemented at Chen Industries. As I described some of our recent projects, I noticed Patricia listening with an expression I'd never seen before. Not the polite attention she'd shown when she was trying to manage me, not the calculating interest she'd displayed when assessing how my decisions might affect her own security, but something that looked almost like pride. After dinner, as we prepared to leave, she approached me with uncharacteristic hesitation. "Maya," she said quietly, "I wanted you to know that I've been following the coverage of your success in the business journals. The recognition you've received, the impact you've had on the company, it's quite impressive." The comment was carefully neutral, but coming from Patricia, it represented a significant acknowledgement. "Thank you," I replied, unsure how to respond to what might have been the first genuine compliment she had ever given me. "Your father would be proud," she added, and for the first time in our relationship, the reference to my father felt like tribute rather than manipulation. The conversation was brief and somewhat awkward, but it marked a turning point in how we related to each other. We would never be close, would never have the warm relationship I'd sometimes imagined might be possible, but we had finally reached a place of mutual respect based on accomplishments rather than family obligations. Robert Steinberg's evolution had been the most dramatic of all the family and board members who had initially questioned my readiness for leadership. After the early challenges where he had tried to limit my authority through structural solutions, he had become one of my most valuable advisors.
Decades of experience in financial management complemented my strategic vision, and his willingness to challenge my ideas in productive ways had helped refine many of the initiatives that ultimately proved most successful. The change in our working relationship became clear during a board meeting where we were discussing a major acquisition opportunity. Rather than questioning my judgment or suggesting we needed additional oversight, Robert presented a detailed financial analysis that supported my recommendation while identifying potential risks that needed to be addressed. "Maya's instincts about this acquisition are sound," he told the other board members. "The target company fits perfectly with our sustainable development strategy, and the financial projections are conservative enough to account for implementation challenges." After the meeting, I thanked him for his support, and he responded with characteristic directness. "Maya, I'm not supporting you because we're family or because I want to avoid conflict. I'm supporting you because you've consistently made decisions that benefit the company and its stakeholders. That's the only criterion that matters for board governance." The relationship had evolved from family politics to professional respect, which made it far more valuable than the manipulative dynamics that had characterized our early interactions. But perhaps the most profound change was in my relationship with Sarah Martinez, who had grown from my closest friend and confidant to my most trusted business partner. Her promotion to Vice President of Operations had been one of my first decisions as CEO, and she'd exceeded every expectation in the role. Sarah had developed into a leader in her own right, respected throughout the organization for her analytical skills and her ability to implement complex initiatives without disrupting ongoing operations. She'd also become my sounding board for major decisions, offering perspectives that helped me consider implications I might have missed. During one of our regular strategy meetings, she made an observation that captured something essential about the journey we'd both taken. "Maya, do you remember those conversations we used to have in supply closets and coffee shops, wondering if we'd ever be taken seriously in this industry?" I laughed, thinking about how paranoid and uncertain we'd been just 2 years earlier. Now we're the people other companies call when they want to understand how to implement sustainable business practices. We're the ones giving advice instead of hoping someone will give us a chance to prove ourselves. She was right. Somewhere along the way, we'd stopped being the underdogs trying to earn recognition and become the established leaders that others look to for guidance. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but the accumulation of successful decisions, positive outcomes, and industry recognition had fundamentally altered how we saw ourselves and how others perceived us. The most tangible evidence of this change came when I received a call from the president of the Pacific Northwest Business Council, inviting me to serve as the organization's next chairperson. The role would involve representing the region's business interests in discussions with state and federal policymakers, overseeing initiatives to promote economic development, and serving as a spokesperson for sustainable business practices across industries. "Maya," the president said during our phone conversation, "your leadership at Chen Industries has demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking we need to address the challenges facing businesses in our region. You've shown that profitability and environmental responsibility aren't competing priorities, and that's a message we need to amplify at the policy level."
The invitation represented recognition not just of my individual success, but of the principles and practices I'd implemented at Chen Industries. It was an opportunity to influence business development across the entire Pacific Northwest, promoting the sustainable approaches that had proved so effective in our own operations. Accepting the role would require additional time and energy, but it also offered a platform to demonstrate that the values-driven leadership that had transformed Chen Industries could work at a much larger scale. After discussing the opportunity with Sarah and other key advisors, I accepted the position. The announcement generated significant media coverage, with business publications highlighting the fact that I was the youngest person ever selected for the role, as well as one of the few women to serve as chairperson in the organization's 50-year history. But the coverage that mattered most to me focused on the substantive agenda I planned to pursue, promoting sustainable business practices, supporting family-owned enterprises, and creating opportunities for underrepresented groups in business leadership. As I prepared for my first official function as chairperson, I stood once again in my office looking out at Elliott Bay. But this time, instead of reflecting on how far I'd come, I found myself thinking about where I wanted to go next. Chen Industries had become everything my father had hoped it could be and more. The company was financially strong, environmentally responsible, and culturally healthy. Our employees were engaged and productive, our clients were satisfied and loyal, and our community partnerships had become models for corporate social responsibility. But I'd also learned that success created new opportunities and responsibilities. The platform I'd built at Chen Industries could serve as a foundation for broader impact, influencing how businesses throughout the region approach the intersection of profitability and social responsibility. The journey from unwanted mistake to recognized leader had taught me that the qualities others had dismissed as weaknesses, thoughtfulness, inclusivity, concern for long-term consequences, were actually essential strengths for navigating the complex challenges facing modern organizations. The skills I'd developed while being underestimated had prepared me for leadership in ways that traditional executive development programs never could have had. Most importantly, I'd learned that earning respect wasn't about conforming to other people's expectations of what leadership should look like. It was about identifying your own strengths, applying them consistently and effectively, and allowing the results to speak for themselves. Standing in that office, I realized that the story of the unwanted mistake who inherited a billion-dollar empire was really just the beginning of a much larger narrative. The real story was about what someone could build when they stopped trying to fit into roles designed for other people and started creating opportunities that matched their actual capabilities. The empire my father had built was secure, but the legacy I
was creating would extend far beyond Chen Industries. It would influence how other family businesses approached succession planning, how other organizations implemented sustainable practices, and how other leaders balanced profitability with social responsibility. That legacy would be measured not just in quarterly returns or stock valuations, but in the number of employees who felt valued and empowered in their work, the communities that benefited from responsible business practices, and the other underestimated individuals who might find inspiration in a story about someone who refused to accept other people's limitations on her potential. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I thought about my father's note that had started this entire transformation. The empire was always meant for you. They never saw what I saw. He'd been right about the inheritance, but he'd been even more right about something else. The real gift wasn't the company itself, but the opportunity to discover capabilities I never knew I possessed, and to use them in ways that created value for everyone around me. The unwanted mistake had become exactly who she was always meant to be. And the best part was, this was only the beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.